In 1910, Wallace Wattles wrote The Science of Getting Rich. And in it, he made an argument that most people have never considered, that acquiring wealth is not only compatible with spiritual development, it's actually necessary for complete spiritual evolution. Wattles argued that you cannot fully develop your spiritual capacities while trapped in survival mode. When you're constantly worried about money, focused on scarcity, or limited in your ability to explore, learn, and grow, your consciousness remains contracted around basic survival needs rather than expanding toward higher possibilities. Let's address the elephant in the room: the biblical programming that has convinced millions of people that wealth is somehow incompatible with spiritual development, that you cannot make it to heaven if you are wealthy. The most commonly quoted verse is Jesus saying, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." This quote has been used for centuries to convince spiritual people that wealth disqualifies them from spiritual evolution. But this interpretation reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of both the context and the deeper meaning of this teaching. Today we're going to talk about why spiritual people struggle with money and how to end the war. For a long time, I've been doing videos on money, and every time I have comments from people that say that it's an example of my greed, that I'm becoming materialist, that it's anti-spiritual, that I shouldn't talk about money so much. Recently, I've dedicated more and more episodes to this topic, and I am receiving more and more feedback from people saying I need to stop, that the channel isn't what it used to be because I'm talking about money too much. But there is a reason I am talking about money so much. As I have coached more and more people, I have found that this is the number one issue that people are struggling with. They have separated their money issues from their spiritual issues, and they do not know how to deal with this discord. Money is a critical part of our survival on this 3D earth. We have to address it. It is a part of our reality. And so I want to deal with this. You have been taught some things over time about money that are simply not true when it comes to spirituality. There's a war going on inside every spiritually conscious person who desires abundance, and it's destroying their ability to create the very wealth that would accelerate their spiritual evolution and expand their capacity to serve. This isn't just about having limiting beliefs about money. This is about a fundamental identity conflict that makes spiritual people the most self-sabotaging group when it comes to financial success. I see it constantly in my work. Brilliant, gifted, spiritually evolved individuals who can shift timelines, connect with higher consciousness, and facilitate profound healing for others. Channel, but who struggle to pay their bills or charge appropriately for their gifts. People who understand the deepest mysteries of consciousness, but have been programmed to believe that money is somehow antithetical to spiritual development. You can see it on my own channel. I have received over 50 offers of sponsorships and advertisements to put on my channel, and I've refused those because I've said, that's not very spiritual. This was my own programming that I have had to deal with. This programming runs so deep that most spiritual people don't even recognize it as programming. They think their financial struggles are evidence of their virtue. Their money guilt is proof of their spiritual purity, and their resistance to wealth is a sign of their evolved consciousness. Today, I want to expose this programming for what it really is: a massive deception that keeps the most conscious people on the planet financially disempowered and therefore limited in their ability to create positive change in the world. The idea that spirituality and wealth are incompatible is one of the most destructive pieces of programming in human consciousness, and it's not an accident. Throughout history, those in power have understood that the easiest way to control spiritually gifted people is to convince them that their gifts shouldn't be profitable, that their service should be sacrifice, and that their highest calling is poverty. Think about it logically for a moment. If you were running a system based on materialism, consumption, and spiritual unconsciousness, what would be your greatest threat? Conscious, spiritually awakened people who have the resources, influence, and platform to offer alternatives to your system. So what would be the most effective way to neutralize that threat? Convince those very people that money is evil, that wealth corrupts spiritual purity, and that true servants of consciousness should remain poor and powerless. This programming has been so effective that we now have millions of spiritually conscious people who possess exactly the wisdom, gifts, and perspectives the world desperately needs, but who lack the financial resources to share those gifts at scale. They're trapped in survival mode, spending their energy on paying bills rather than changing the world. Meanwhile, the most unconscious, materially focused people accumulate vast wealth and use it to shape culture, politics, education, and media in ways that perpetuate unconsciousness. The very people who would offer healing alternatives to our destructive systems have been convinced that they shouldn't pursue the very tool that would give them the power to implement those alternatives. This is not spiritual evolution. This is spiritual disempowerment disguised as virtue. The truth is that money is neither spiritual nor unspiritual. Money is a tool. And like any tool, its value is determined by how it's used and by the consciousness of the person using it. A hammer can build a house or destroy one. Fire can cook food or burn down forests. Money can fund unconscious consumption or conscious creation. When conscious people avoid money, they don't eliminate money's influence in the world. They simply ensure that money remains in the hands of unconscious people who use it in unconscious ways. Every spiritually aware person who remains financially limited is essentially voting for unconsciousness to maintain economic control. The separation of spirituality and wealth isn't just illogical. It's spiritually irresponsible. It's a form of spiritual bypassing that allows conscious people to feel morally superior while remaining practically powerless to create the changes they know are needed. Let's address the elephant in the room, the biblical programming that has convinced millions of people that wealth is somehow incompatible with spiritual development, that you cannot make it to heaven if you are wealthy. The most commonly quoted verse is Jesus saying, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." This quote has been used for centuries to convince spiritual people that wealth disqualifies them from spiritual evolution. But this interpretation reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of both the context and the deeper meaning of this teaching. First, let's examine the historical context. In Jesus' time, wealth was typically accumulated through exploitation, slavery, corruption, and oppression. The rich men Jesus was referring to were people who had gained wealth through unconscious means and who used that wealth to maintain systems of suffering and inequality. Jesus wasn't condemning wealth itself. He was pointing out that wealth accumulated through unconscious means and used for unconscious purposes creates energetic attachments that make higher consciousness difficult to access. He was talking about consciousness, not money. But here's the part that's been deliberately obscured. Jesus wasn't advocating for poverty. He was advocating for conscious wealth creation and conscious wealth usage. Throughout the biblical narratives, we see Jesus supported by wealthy followers who used their resources to fund his ministry and spread his teachings. The eye of the needle wasn't just a metaphor. It was actually a reference to a narrow gate in Jerusalem that camels could only pass through if they were unloaded and guided carefully. The teaching isn't that it's impossible for wealthy to enter higher consciousness. It's that wealth requires conscious navigation to avoid the unconscious attachments that limit spiritual development. In other words, Jesus was teaching wealth consciousness, not wealth avoidance. But even if we take the traditional interpretation at face value, we have to ask, what did Jesus mean by rich? In his time, having enough food for tomorrow made you wealthy compared to most people. By historical standards, anyone listening to this is already incredibly rich. If this verse meant that wealth disqualifies spiritual evolution, then virtually everyone in the developed world would be spiritually disqualified. The deeper truth is that Jesus was teaching about attachment, not abundance. He was pointing out that when wealth becomes your identity, your security, your God, it creates energetic blockages that limit your spiritual development. But when wealth is held consciously, used compassionately, and viewed as a tool for service rather than an end in itself, it becomes a powerful vehicle for spiritual expression. Look at the greatest spiritual teachers throughout history. The Buddha came from wealth. Many of the most influential spiritual movements were funded by wealthy patrons. The idea that poverty equals spirituality is not supported by spiritual history. It's a distortion that has served to keep conscious people disempowered. In 1910, Wallace Wattles wrote The Science of Getting Rich, and in it, he made an argument that most people have never considered, that acquiring wealth is not only compatible with spiritual development, it's actually necessary for complete spiritual evolution. Wattles argued that you cannot fully develop your spiritual capacities while trapped in survival mode. When you're constantly worried about money, focused on scarcity, or limited in your ability to explore, learn, and grow, your consciousness remains contracted around basic survival needs rather than expanding toward higher possibilities. Think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs from a spiritual perspective. If you're stuck at the bottom of the pyramid, struggling to meet basic financial requirements, how much energy and attention do you have available for self-actualization, spiritual practice, or service to others? Wattles pointed out that true spiritual development requires the freedom to explore, to study, to travel, to experience different cultures and perspectives, to experiment with consciousness, to dedicate time to practices that don't generate immediate income. All of this requires financial resources. Consider the great spiritual explorers and teachers. They didn't develop their understanding while trapped in poverty. They had resources, either their own or provided by others, to pursue spiritual development as their primary focus rather than as something they squeezed in around survival activities. But Wattles went even further. He argued that poverty is actually a form of spiritual limitation because it keeps you focused on lack, scarcity, and limitation rather than abundance, possibility, and expansion. When you're constantly experiencing financial stress, you're training your consciousness in contraction rather than expansion. Spiritual development is fundamentally about expanding consciousness, increasing your capacity to perceive and create from higher perspectives, developing your abilities to serve and contribute at greater levels. Poverty consciousness contracts all of these capacities. Abundance consciousness expands them. This doesn't mean that wealth automatically creates spiritual development. Unconscious wealth can certainly create spiritual obstacles, but conscious wealth, wealth that's created and used with awareness and intention, becomes a powerful tool for spiritual evolution. When you have abundant resources, you can invest in your spiritual development in ways that aren't available to people trapped in survival mode. You can study with teachers, attend retreats, explore different modalities, dedicate time to practice, travel to sacred sites, experience different cultures, and invest in healing and growth opportunities. And give yourself the time to actually read a book. Most importantly, abundance gives you the freedom to follow your spiritual guidance without having to compromise due to financial limitations. You can pursue your true calling rather than just whatever pays the bills. You can serve based on what is needed rather than what's profitable. Here's a perspective that completely reframes the relationship between money and spirituality. Money is simply amplified capacity to serve. Every dollar you earn consciously is a dollar that can be used to create positive change in the world. Every dollar that you don't earn is service you can't provide, problems you can't solve, and positive impact you can't create. Let's get practical about this. If you want to help people heal trauma, you need resources to train in healing modalities, to create healing spaces, to reach people who need healing. If you want to promote conscious living, you need resources to communicate your message, to create content, to build platforms that can compete with unconscious media. If you want to protect the environment, you need resources to invest in sustainable technologies, to support environmental organizations, to create alternatives to destructive industries. If you want to promote spiritual development, you need resources to create educational materials, to build communities, to support other spiritual teachers and teachings. Every major positive change in the world has required financial resources to implement. The civil rights movement needed funding. Environmental protection requires funding. Spiritual movements require funding. Social justice requires funding. Even Jesus' ministry was funded by wealthy supporters. The unconscious programming says money corrupts spiritual work. But the truth is, lack of money limits spiritual work. When spiritual people remain financially limited, they limit their capacity to serve at the level the world needs them to serve. Let's examine this through the lens of someone who's often held up as the ultimate example of spiritual poverty, Mother Teresa. She's been canonized, not just by the Catholic Church, but by our collective consciousness as the epitome of spiritual service through poverty and self-sacrifice. But here's what most people don't know about Mother Teresa's approach and why it was ultimately misguided despite her good intentions. Her vow of poverty and her insistence that the poor should remain poor because suffering brings them closer to Christ actually perpetuated the very suffering she claimed to be alleviating. Mother Teresa's clinics in Calcutta were deliberately kept in substandard conditions. She refused donations of medical equipment and proper facilities because she believed that suffering was spiritually purifying. She famously said that the poor give us much more than we give them, and that poverty is a beautiful thing. But poverty is not beautiful. Poverty is a form of violence that prevents people from accessing their full potential, their creativity, their capacity to contribute. When Mother Teresa refused to use available resources to actually lift people out of poverty, she was perpetuating a system that kept people trapped in limitation while calling it spiritual. The millions of dollars donated to her organization could have been used to build hospitals, schools, job training programs, and infrastructure that would have permanently improved people's lives. Instead, those resources were used to maintain basic hospices that kept people comfortable in their suffering rather than empowering them to transcend it. This is what poverty consciousness does. Even when it's well-intentioned, it mistakes limitation for virtue, suffering for spirituality, and powerlessness for purity. It creates a spiritual identity that's invested in remaining helpless, rather than becoming empowered to create real change. The truth is that Mother Teresa's approach, while compassionate, was ultimately disempowering to everyone involved. The people she served remained trapped in poverty, and other spiritual people were taught that financial limitation was somehow more virtuous than resource abundance. Contrast this with spiritual leaders who understood conscious wealth creation. The Buddha, despite his teachings on non-attachment, accepted support from wealthy patrons that allowed his teachings to spread widely. Jesus was supported by wealthy followers who funded his ministry. Many of the most influential spiritual movements were able to create lasting change precisely because they had access to resources that could be deployed for maximum impact. When conscious people have resources, they can build schools, hospitals, retreat centers, educational programs, and technological solutions that create lasting positive change. They can hire teams that multiply their impact. They can reach people who need help but can't access it due to financial barriers. I learned this lesson in my own journey. For years, I limited my income because I believed that charging for spiritual work somehow diminished its value or corrupted its purity. I thought I would lose credibility. I kept my prices low, gave away most of my content for free, never accepted sponsorships, refused to do events, and prided myself on being financially humble. You know it, especially those who have followed me for a long time. What I realized was that this financial limitation was actually a form of selfishness, disguised as service. By keeping myself financially limited, I was limiting my capacity to reach people who needed help, to invest in better content creation, to hire team members who could amplify the work, to create programs that could serve people at deeper levels. When I finally released this programming that equated financial limitation with spiritual purity, everything changed. I could invest in higher quality production, reach more people, create more comprehensive programs, hire experts who could improve every aspect of the work, and ultimately serve at levels that were impossible when I was financially constrained. The money didn't corrupt the spiritual work. The money amplified the spiritual work. It allowed me to serve at the level that matched my internal calling rather than being limited by external financial constraints. This is true for every conscious person. The question isn't whether you should pursue wealth. The question is, how much service are you being called to provide? And what level of financial resources would allow you to provide that service most effectively? When you reframe wealth as service capacity rather than personal accumulation, everything changes. You're not pursuing money for selfish reasons. You're developing your financial capacity to match your service capacity. You're not trying to get rich. You're trying to become as effective as possible at contributing to the healing and evolution of the world. Here's what makes this spiritual money conflict so destructive. It creates a fundamental identity war with conscious people. Part of them wants to create abundance and impact, but another part believes that wanting wealth makes them spiritually inferior. This internal conflict doesn't just create emotional distress, it creates energetic contradiction that makes consistent manifestation impossible. At the conscious level, you might be visualizing abundance, affirming prosperity, and using manifestation techniques. But at the unconscious level, you might be carrying beliefs that money is the root of all evil, that wealthy people are greedy, that spiritual people shouldn't be materialistic, or I don't deserve wealth when others are suffering. These unconscious beliefs aren't just thoughts. They're identity structures that automatically generate thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that sabotage financial success. You might find yourself undercharging for your services, avoiding opportunities for greater income, or unconsciously creating financial crises that keep you in struggle mode. I know this because that is what I did. This identity conflict is particularly intense for people who were raised in religious or spiritual environments that promoted poverty consciousness. The programming runs so deep that pursuing wealth can trigger genuine feelings of guilt, shame, or spiritual betrayal. Many people I meet believe that any pursuit of wealth means they will not go to heaven, that they will go to hell. But here's what you need to understand. This identity conflict is not serving your spiritual development. It is limiting it. When you're internally divided about money, you can't show up fully in any aspect of your life. You're spending tremendous energy managing internal contradictions rather than creating external contributions. The resolution requires more than just changing your beliefs about money. It requires a fundamental identity transformation at the deepest levels. You need to become someone for whom conscious wealth creation feels natural, aligned, and spiritually appropriate. This transformation involves releasing identity structures that were formed through religious programming, family conditioning, and cultural messaging about money and spirituality. It requires developing new identity structures that integrate spiritual development with conscious wealth creation. But here's what makes this particularly challenging. Most of this identity programming is unconscious. You can't just think your way out of patterns that were installed below the level of conscious awareness. You need to approach that work at the identity level that can actually rewire the unconscious programming that's creating the internal conflict. This is where future self-integration becomes incredibly powerful for money work, as it has been for me, as it has been for my clients. When you connect with future versions of yourself through a meditation, who have successfully resolved the spirituality wealth conflict, who are both spiritually evolved and financially abundant, who use money consciously as a tool for service, you can download their identity structure around money. Instead of trying to convince your current identity that wealth is okay, you can step into the identity of a future self for whom conscious wealth creation is natural and automatic. Instead of fighting against money guilt, you can embody the consciousness of someone who has never experienced that guilt because they understand money's true spiritual purpose. Now, I want to give you a process that will help you begin resolving the spiritual money conflict at the identity level. This isn't about changing your beliefs through willpower or repetition. This is about connecting with aspects of your consciousness that have already integrated spirituality and wealth in healthy, conscious ways. This creates an immediate shift, not something that takes years and years of time, which is what it took for you to develop these beliefs. Now close your eyes and take several deep breaths. Feel yourself settling into your body and into this moment where healing and transformation are always possible. Begin by acknowledging the conflict you may have felt around money and spirituality. Without judgment, simply notice any guilt, shame, or confusion you've experienced about wanting financial abundance while being committed to spiritual development. Feel where this conflict lives in your body, how it creates tension or contraction. Now, I want you to imagine that you can step forward in time and connect with a version of yourself that exists on a timeline where you never developed this conflict. This is a version of you that grew up understanding that money is a neutral tool that becomes spiritual or unspiritual based on how it's used and the consciousness behind it. Take a moment to feel this future self's presence. You can do it. It's available within you. It takes just a moment. Notice how relaxed they are around money, how natural wealth feels to them, how easily they integrate financial success with spiritual development. They don't experience the internal war that you might be familiar with. They're not affected by what they hear from the outside world. Now ask this future self, how do you think about money in relationship to spirituality? And listen to their response. Just take a moment and listen. Money is spiritual energy in physical form. It's a tool for amplifying consciousness and service. The more consciously you earn and use money, the more spiritual your relationship with it will become. Feel how different this perspective is from the programming you may have received. Notice that for this future self, wealth does not diminish spirituality, it amplifies it. Now ask, how did you release the guilt and conflict around money? Listen to their response within your consciousness. Understand that guilt about money is actually a form of spiritual ego, a way of feeling superior to others while remaining powerless to create change. Understand that staying poor does not help poor people. Financial limitation doesn't increase spiritual purity. Listen to the guidance they offer about releasing money guilt and embracing conscious wealth creation. Ask them, how do you use money in spiritual ways? Feel them showing you how wealth can be used to support spiritual development, to fund consciousness education, to help others access healing and growth opportunities, to create beauty and inspiration in the world, to protect natural environments, to support conscious businesses and organizations. See money flowing through their life, not as an end in itself, but as a means of amplifying love, service, and positive impact. Now ask, what would you tell my current self about pursuing wealth as a spiritual person? Be open to receiving guidance that challenges your current perspective. Understand your spiritual gifts are meant to be shared widely, not kept small due to limitations. The world needs you to have resources so you can compete with unconscious systems and offer real alternatives. Feel your future self's certainty that conscious wealth creation is not only spiritually appropriate, it's spiritually necessary for the healing and evolution of the world. From this perspective, look back at your current financial situation. See your current limitations not as any form of spiritual purity, but as unconscious programming that is preventing you from serving at your highest capacity. Now begin to allow this future self's identity around money to merge with your current consciousness. Feel their comfort with wealth, their understanding of money as spiritual energy, their joy in using resources to amplify service and impact. Notice any resistance that arises. If guilt or fear comes up, don't fight it. Simply ask your future self to help you understand why that programming exists and how to release it with love and compassion. Feel yourself taking on more and more of this future self's relationship with money. Feel how different it is to want wealth from a place of service rather than selfishness, to pursue abundance as a spiritual practice rather than a spiritual compromise. Make a commitment to begin living from this new identity right now. Choose one specific way you can start treating money more consciously, whether that's charging appropriately for your services, investing in your spiritual development, or using money in ways that align with your values. Now, before completing this integration, express gratitude to that future self for sharing their wisdom, their evolved relationship with money. Take several deep breaths, feeling this new identity around money anchoring in your system. Know that you can return to this future self's perspective whenever old programming tries to resurface. When you're ready, gently open your eyes, carrying this integrated understanding of money and spirituality back into normal consciousness. What you just experienced is the beginning of what's possible when you approach money blocks as identity work rather than just belief work. This kind of deep identity transformation around money requires optimal conditions and expert guidance, because the programming runs so deep and is so culturally reinforced. Money identity work is some of the most challenging transformation you can undertake. That's why I've been creating so many activations around it, because this speaks to my heart. I'm seeing it, and I want to help you to transform it. It requires releasing programming that was installed by family, religion, culture, and society so deep you're not even aware of it. You're not just changing personal beliefs, you're stepping outside collective consciousness patterns that most people never question. This is why money identity transformation happens most effectively in intensive supported environments. When you're surrounded by others who are releasing money programming, guided by someone who has successfully navigated this transformation, held in a space where conscious wealth creation is normalized and celebrated, breakthrough becomes more possible. Individual money work can take years because you're working against such powerful cultural programming while trying to maintain your normal life patterns in your normal life environment. But when you create the right conditions, identity transformation around money can happen rapidly and permanently. That's what led me to design this intensive experience I've repeatedly talked about in Los Angeles, coming up in November, on November 21st through the 23rd. Tickets are still available. This is the shift into your greatest timeline. We're creating the perfect environment for the kind of deep money identity work that allows spiritual people to finally end the war between consciousness and wealth, surrounded by people that will support you even after this event is over. This is not about learning new techniques or changing your thoughts about money. It's a fundamental identity reconstruction around wealth, guided by someone who has successfully integrated spirituality and abundance and helped thousands of others do the same. Get a ticket so that I can meet you personally. You can get it at www.brianscottlive.com/event-November. The war between your spirituality and your desire for abundance is not serving your spiritual development or your capacity to serve the world. It's a programming that was installed to keep conscious people disempowered and therefore unable to challenge unconscious systems with conscious alternatives. Your spiritual gifts were meant to be shared widely, not kept small due to financial limitations. Your capacity to serve is meant to grow, not remain constrained by poverty consciousness. Your ability to create positive change in the world is meant to expand, not contract due to money guilt. The version of yourself that has resolved this conflict, that creates wealth consciously and uses it spiritually, that serves at the level your soul is calling you to serve, is not some distant possibility. They exist right now, in this moment, in your consciousness, waiting for you to step into their identity and embody their relationship with money and spirituality. If you're ready to end the war between consciousness and wealth, if you want to experience what money identity transformation looks like when all the optimal conditions are present, then step into your transformation right now. And if you need help, I'm here to help you. And I will continue to create content to help you transform this, because this is my soul calling. Because I've been through it and I want to help you transform as well. Whether you join me in LA or pursue this healing through your own work, remember, staying financially limited does not help anyone. It doesn't increase your purity. It doesn't help poor people. It doesn't serve the world. It only ensures that unconscious people maintain control while conscious people remain powerless to create the changes they know are needed. Your abundant, prosperous future is calling to you. The world needs conscious people with resources like you, and the integration can begin today. I will see you on the abundant side of consciousness. You can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com. And welcome to The Reality Revolution. Hello, it's Brian Scott. And I'm beyond excited to finally announce a live, in-person, 3-day event that I'm hosting in Los Angeles on November 21st through the 23rd. And when you walk away from this event, your life will be changed forever. Whatever it is that you're looking for right now, if you need to heal from something, to find the love of your life, to find wealth, to find your purpose, to ascend, to evolve, whatever that is, whatever your desire, this event is designed to bring that to you. There is a timeline available for you where you can live the very best life that you could ever imagine, where everything is always working out for you. And this event is designed to shift you into that reality and make it something tangible and real that you experience. I promise you that this will change your life.